Hello, how are you doing? All right, well, what I want to ask is, are there any questions, anything that seems to be unclear, anything that I need to be made aware of, etc., before we get into test one? How are you guys doing? By all means, just one at a time if you want to just unmute or do it by way of something that looks like a text. Sure, sure. And what may that question be? A Rush. Give a moment to have the student write it out. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. I'll begin writing the names down for extra credit. I'll add to your test one score. Okay. Yes, they are a combination thereof, Maria Diaz. Most of them are multiple choice. Some of them are true false. But yeah, so that's a great question. Anybody else? Oh, note also, okay, is that remember for the first test, I'll probably send this in another announcement. No essay questions, Sabrina. No, that's a good question. No essay questions. Yes, Aaron? Oh, no problem. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. All right. Remember the first test, and please take advantage of this. You could take it unlimited times. So by all means, take it until you ace it. Okay. I won't, however, I probably will not allow that on tests 2 and 3. Okay. To me, that's a little bit too much for a collegiate class. But the first test, you don't know what's coming at you. You're not familiar yet with my style of writing tests. So by all means, I'm okay with that. There we go. Sorry. Sorry, I'm a terrible multitasker. But I hope you're doing okay on your assignments. I finally have a video up for assignments 3 and 4. So I would highly recommend that you take a look at those. Before long, you probably won't need to look at them. They just give some context. Although I don't know, I might qualify that statement that I just made because sometimes I'll sneak in a point that is covered on the test that will not, that's not necessarily in the argumentative assignment. All right. So matter of fact, I would continue to watch the videos. Okay. I try to give you context. Great question. The first couple assignments, if you will give me about 4 more days, okay. I'm preparing a speech. I know this is kind of perhaps TMI, but I'm preparing a speech for a memorial for my grandfather. And I've just begun working on that and trying to get everything up this week for you guys. I mean, what a busy week, right? 2 assignments and 1 test in 1 week. That's just crazy. But I feel compelled to do so to get everything done under contract by semester. I pretty much vow to teach you from pre-Columbian Native Americans at least through the Civil War, if not Reconstruction. And in the pace that we're on, we're not even going to get to Reconstruction. This is just hitting the minimal of the Civil War. Okay. And so yeah, if you'll please indulge me about 4 more days after my grandfather's memorial, I will absolutely jump right on your assignments. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. And what else? I'm going to give you, let's see here, some of the argumentative sections have red colored words. Does that mean what it does mean is that I'm trying to highlight that. To me, subjectively, that was meant to convey a vital point to that section. All right. No problem. That's a good question. So yeah, it's meant to be kind of highlighted for your special attention, if you would. Okay. Like I said, you'll get a hold of these assignments. You'll get a hold of my quirky style in no time, and you'll be able to discern the thesis, intelligently evaluate it. Like anything, it is an acquired skill, and almost without exception, every semester, my students' responses get better throughout the semester as it becomes, I believe they could attest, easier for them to do so. Okay, so hang in there. But boy, what a pace, huh, that we're on. It's just kind of crazy how quickly we're going through these subjects. Because normally, right, during the fall or spring semester, we would be covering one subject per semester or one subject per week. And you guys at times are, doing 3 per week. So, oops. So I applaud you for that. So remember, Rose, the red, when I do that in red, I mean to bring that to your special attention. Okay. I mean to bring that which is in red to me is highly integral to the thesis that was meant to be conveyed in that section. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we get on to test 1?
Yeah, when is the actual test? Because again, there's like, it says the 24th as in tomorrow, but it says 26th on the due date.
Yes, that's right. So technically, right, you could work on it now if you have finished your okay, so I had a question about the North American colonies. Let me get to that just in a moment, okay? So yeah, just as soon as you can, you could take a look at the test, and it's due midnight of Saturday to Sunday midnight, the 26th to the 27th. All right. So make sure you submit your answers by then. But by all means, take it as soon as you want and retake it as many times as you want. So you become familiar with the questions, you become familiar with the data that you need to know, familiar with the style, etc. But I hope to really facilitate that today during this. No, that's a good question, Markyle. You are going to take the test on your own, just as you would the assignments. Yeah, on your own time by yourself, please. All right. And most of the time, especially for test 1, I allow you to do open notes anyway. So by all means, keep your argumentative assignments handy, available to as a reference. I would definitely recommend that. Okay. With the New England colonies, remember the first one was court history, where it praises New England as being progressive, ahead of its day, right? And there are at least 3 different, let's see here. No, you have until the 17th to do all the quizzes, and actually the semester ends the 24th of next month. So yeah, please don't turn anything in after. I mean, really, there have been semesters for some reason in which they have not even Canvas has not even permitted assignments on the final day, and that's beyond my control. I don't understand why. And so, matter of fact, to play it safely, I would turn everything in if you could by the 23rd. Okay. Although it should be okay. Most of the time, when I put in due date, last day, the 24th, it should be okay. But yeah, certainly not the 26th and 27th, Markyle. And remember, these two assignments are due tonight, Wednesday, the 23rd. And remember also is I deduct usually about 10 points if you turned it in lately. Sometimes if I notice it's a few minutes after midnight, I deduct like 5 points. All right. And so 40, 45 points, even 35 points, turn it in at the end of the semester. Those 35 points add up and can easily equate to an entire letter grade difference. So something in my class, and any class I would suspect, is better than nothing. So by all means, if you have to turn some in late, do so. That's better than not turning them in at all. But as for assignments 3 and 4 on the southern and northern colonies, they're actually due tonight, okay, at midnight. So the first one on New England colonies is court history. The writer tries to convey that they were ahead of their time, democratically, in egalitarian fashion, big on education, right? Their kind of regulated capitalist economy was ahead of its time, okay, etc. All right, and their egalitarian religion, putting people on equal footing somewhat, although Puritans certainly didn't do that. So if you want to argue against it, right, you could say that there's insufficient data. Give me an example of other types of ways that it could have been proven that they were ahead of their time. You could give data on number 2 to convey that it conveniently omitted or left out data that showed them to be a little bit backward, like with the Salem witch trials and the way they would banish people and their combination of church and state, right? So by all means, you could use data from number 2 to countermand that which is put in number 1 and say how all that stuff was conveniently omitted. Because an historian, right, can be, let's see here. Yes, that's a good way of putting it, Rose, is that the tests are almost solely based on the argumentative assignments and the quizzes are solely based on the textbook. That's absolutely, I think that's a safe conclusion to make. All right. So at any rate, then with number 2, it does a 180, right? And it criticizes the Puritans and it shows how they were very intolerant, very xenophobic, very hierarchical and inequitable, right? They had a religious ruling elite for all their egalitarian rhetoric about the priesthood of all believers. All people should be free to interpret the Bible on their own in their own home. The Puritans didn't live up to that, did they? According to the data in number 2. So that's what was meant to be conveyed at a macro level with number 2, okay? And then number 3 is going to praise, it's going to be court history of William Penn, saying how much power he had and how he relinquished that power in very Quaker, meek fashion and shared power with a legislator. He shared land with the poor. He provided almshouses and available credit, available land, right? And so it praises him in his meekness and sharing opportunities. And so that Pennsylvania developed a reputation relative to other colonies as being a land of relative opportunity, economic opportunity, and of course, representative government, okay? But then on the next one, on number 4, it shows nuance to that and says, well, was he really that humanitarian toward the Native Americans? And he still was rather cliquey with the fur trade and with the best of land in Philadelphia, et cetera, with himself and with his own clique. So number 4 is revisionist history. It revises the praise of William Penn, and it shows a more complex, a more nuanced view of him, okay? And are there any questions on the Southern Colonies handout? Hopefully you've had time to watch my video, and I tried to go through each number. But are there any numbers in particular?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I was looking up one of the words that you had highlighted as red, but it doesn't, I'm not getting the right definition when I look it up. It was called mitote.
Oh, the mitote?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
couldn't find out what that meant.
That was just, I don't know why, I guess just really trying to highlight how, in very argumentative fashion, tried to highlight how savage the Native Americans could be at times. They would just tie a person to a stake and they would begin poking and prodding that person and lighting that person on fire. And they would eventually begin cutting from the thighs and the calves, and they would ritualistically eat that person. Yeah, it's
They didn't
rather,
mention anything about eating.
yeah, they at least those in the Galveston area of Texas and others, the Muskogean and other tribes, yeah, that actually was true, and the Iroquois as well in New York, with the Matote. So many tribes that I have read of that practiced the Matote, it did actually end in cannibalism. And the belief was, right, is that they were imbibing the good qualities of the warrior, that they were going to take on his courage, his ferocity, his strength, etc., in eating him. The Aztec or Mexica, they did the same thing. All right. Anybody else before we move on to the test? Okay, so let's go ahead and move right into the test. Okay, so I'm looking at the test, so I'm going to try to go directly through it. All right, so I have here, which of the following is an alleged reason for which knowledge of Native American culture and history is incomplete? So first and foremost, right, is there is a scarcity of primary sources. Many of the native tribes did not have at least a phonetic, beyond just a pictographic of just pictures representing words and meanings of things, right, an abstract meaning. So it's difficult to ascertain primary sources, as much as you could find in Mesoamerica, for instance. So we don't have a lot from the horse's mouth, straight from them, their own writings. Because remember, in Mesoamerica, they had like the stela, they had the codices, these written pictographic accounts, not just pictographic, but phonetic with the Mayan, that would demonstrate what happened under the reign of a certain ruler, the major events that happened under his or her reign, and then the following ruler and the following ruler, etc. And the Spaniards, they were able to connect the dates to the Julian Christian calendar. And then, of course, science has helped us out with carbon-14 dating and other methods, right? Stratigraphy of the soil, are able to kind of collaborate with that so that we can get a good picture of what happened when in Mesoamerica. Yes, on my, let's see here. Am I supposed to be sharing the screen? Yes. Are there quite a few of you who cannot see me right now?
I can see it.
Your
Okay.
screen is shared now.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Good. Let's get this out of here. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so test one. Thank you for bringing that to my attention, because on my end, all I could see is is myself. So I was just assuming everyone could see me. So you see there, you have lack of written sources. C. Vance Haynes' thesis, right? That it does not dovetail with carbon dates down in South America. That is true as well, right? We felt confident when I was a child in the 80s and 90s, growing up, that it was taken as absolute truth that the natives came about 13,000 years ago, in the midst of the final, most recent ice age known as the Wisconsin era, and that it seems perfect that there were two glaciers and there was an ice-free corridor. There was a amount of land that did not experience glacial movement. So it would have made sense perfectly for them to go right through that corridor, right, about 13,000 years ago. But they had remains and artifacts that were carbon dated to as old as 30,000 years ago in South America, in Bolivia, and I think even Chile. And so, and then also they went through that ice-free corridor and they were looking for evidence of human habitation, right? A carbon footprint, they call it. And they did not find much of one because people leave behind refuse of all different sorts where they live somewhere, hunting, etc., right? And there's not a lot of evidence for that. So now that C. Vance Haynes theory that they came 13,000 years ago through displacement of the glaciers, the Bering Sea already shallow, really went down in levels so that it could have created a land bridge that they could have literally walked across from Siberia to Alaska. It doesn't fit perfectly anymore. And so now I just one more thing to throw things into doubt. All right. Alleged cultural, linguistic, and biological ties between Native Americans and indigenous Siberians have not convinced academia universally. That is true as well. And I tried to convey that. Um, they, uh, they have certain mitochondrial DNA, genetic markers that they've taken blood from different groups. And remember, that group has to be homogenous. You have to have been rather homogeneously from Native American heritage for this thing to even work. And that's difficult to prove. Um, but when they took blood from Native Americans and who they believed to be, Native American, and from Asians, they shared certain rare genetic markers like the Diego allele and the GMAT. And so a lot of people became convinced that that's evidence that the Native Americans are Asian in origin, but it has been far from universally accepted. All right, it's still challenged. So that's true as well. And European chronicles are alleged by many to be ethnocentric and skewed. The whole idea, like with anthropology, right? Can you be a participant observer and truly throw aside your own worldview and see another culture as it is without the bias of your own lenses as a European? And especially in the early modern era of the 15 and 1600s, a lot of people contend that no, you cannot. So that was meant to be true as well. Okay, so all of those are reasons for which we have a lot of difficulty, a lot of vagueness, a lot of uncertainty about Native American history. We have a lot of obstacles in our way that still have yet to be overcome. Okay, so that was the point I meant to convey. I want to teach you, if you're not already, perhaps you're already familiar with Native American history. All right. Then number two, which of the following points was not conveyed concerning Native American cultural achievements? European colonizers and modern academia usually look for evidence of manipulation of the environment, development of complex society, artistic expression, knowledge of the sciences and technology, and monotheism, belief in one God, as indicators of how civilized a society is. Well, that's unfair, right? To put that European criteria for Native Americans to have to meet. And that is true. Okay. And I have that on a slide on my PowerPoint. Okay. Of those general kind of 5 criteria, if you will. Yeah, artistic expression is on there. I was going to say, I think I left one out, but it's in there. Letter B, that considering the isolation of the Americas, the natives' Neolithic farming revolution was relatively early in some places. Yes. You could find that in the book 1491 by Horace C. Mann. He contends that as far as the farming revolution goes, that Native America not being able to piggyback off of other societies, because when you find the earliest evidence, allegedly, of the farming revolution, you find it in the Near East and Mesopotamia, you find it in Africa, and you find it in Asia. But notice not Europe. Europe was able, arguably, to piggyback in many ways off of these other societies because their lands are largely contiguous. It's constant land eventually touching one another. And the Native Americans were surrounded by 2 oceans. So they were largely on their own. So according to Horace C. Mann, the Native Americans did pretty darn well as far as their technological and other types of cultural advancement being on their own and having to do it on their own. Okay. C, notice I do this quite often, is you're looking for the one that is not true. Okay, so don't be confused. Which of the following points was not, and I put it in all caps, conveyed. C, that evidence for alleged signs of civilization within future U.S. territory appears earliest in the American Southwest and along the Mississippi River. That is true as well. And that throws kind of a monkey wrench into the kind of simple thesis that civilization occurs where it is ecologically the easiest to construct. And of course, what do you need? What do human beings need? They need water. And so you look at the old world, it was by the Tigris, the Euphrates River, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, where civilization, some of the earliest, the Nile River, some of the earliest civilizations were established, right? But the Southwest, albeit they contend ecologically that it was not as arid and hot as it is today, it still was relatively such. And they still had some of the earliest civilizations there in present day Arizona and New Mexico. And remember, we went over that with the Anasazi, the Mogollon, and other tribes that were there. You have Pueblo Bonito, Chaco Canyon. They had farming, irrigation system that was very sophisticated, writing system, knowledge of astronomy. Their architecture was impressive, and that doesn't make a lot of sense in line with the simple thesis of things. So things are complicated, right? However, what they do tie together is that they had a lot of the same pictographic and cultural characteristics as Mesoamericans. And they even had goods and products from Mesoamerica found in Arizona. So were they related to them? Did they just engage in cultural diffusion where they traded with one another and hence borrowed from one another culturally, etc.? And so whatever it is, that is true. And then remember the Mississippi River, a fascinating culture that developed were the Adena, Adena. Just some a mound culture, an early mound culture, and just rather impressive. Even before farming, had somewhat of a stratified society of a religious and military elite, an emperor of some sort who was buried with great riches, separate from everyone else, etc., etc. All right. And then D, that the Plains tribes met criteria for civilized status first within the U.S. No, that has not been proven. All right. Although on the plains, I will say in their defense that by the 17 and 1800s, when they found the natives nomadic and hunting the bison, the buffalo, right? They thought that they were still in the nomadic hunter-gatherer stage. That wasn't fair. They had farmed. You look at the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and other tribes. A lot of them farmed for a while and then reverted back to hunting and gathering as their primary means of survival. And so there's not, that goes against the neat thesis that once you start the farming revolution, you don't go back. All right. And so that D is not true. Number 3, what was mentioned as common cultural traits shared by many American tribes? Remember, that was the last number on the argumentative section. A religious tendency toward animism, shamanism, polytheism, and pantheism? Yes, those are all mentioned in there. I don't think I'm going to take the time right now for the sake of just getting through the test of going through each of those systems. But I like to think that they were at least briefly introduced in that final section on the argumentative assignment for Native Americans. Technological knowledge of mining minerals. Yes, that is true, especially in Mesoamerica. So let's see here, common cultural traits. So yeah, that actually is true. Development of military technology superior to that of the European colonizers. Well, let's see here. Actually, I apologize, okay? The knowledge of mining was predominantly amongst the northeastern tribes and the Mesoamerican tribes. But as a common cultural trait found amongst all the tribes throughout the United States, I apologize. mining was not widespread. It was not universal. So I take that back. I apologize. Development of military technology superior to that of the European colonizers, you know that not to be true. Just gunpowder alone, the crossbow, etc. The Europeans had a great advantage in military technology. And that's why they were so paranoid against selling weaponry to the Native Americans. Some even gave a death penalty to any Europeans or Euro Americans caught selling guns to Native Americans. They wanted to keep that monopoly against them in the event of war. And then neither is it true. Failure to engage in sedentary farming. Farming was quite widespread. So they didn't fail to do that. They succeeded. So all of them are wrong except for A. Okay. So sorry to confuse you there. Two stereotypical images of Native Americans commonly portrayed in European chronicles are innocent and childlike, or bestial savages. Yes. And remember that was established under the Spanish. I think of Las Casas and Sepulveda having their famous debates before the Spanish monarch, and each of them adhered to those stereotypes. Las Casas, that they were meek sheep, liken them to Adam and Eve before the fall, being innocent of evil, innocent of European greed, etc., and kind of a condescending manner, right? And infantilizing them. And Sepulveda thought that they were savage beasts, okay, and worthy of just war treatment. Okay, so that's
Professor,
true. Yes,
is this the actual test or is this just a study?
this is the actual test. Okay.
Okay.
And so, so what I'm not going to do it this thoroughly on test 2 and 3 for probably an obvious reason. You guys are in college. I'm not sure how it varies from time to time. I might show it and then have a student ask, have you ask me and just say, okay, students, which number do you feel we have not covered, etc. Or just generically just lecture to you about the basics on each of the topics. But in the future, I won't go number by number like this. Okay, this is kind of, I hope you guys don't find this patronizing. But like I said, because this is the first test, you're not familiar with my style. We're in such a fast pace. I have no problem doing this on the first test. Okay. So number 5, even by today's standards, Spanish colonization of the Americas was democratic, pluralistic, and tolerant? No, right? Remember, that's the Black legend, is that they serve as a convenient anti-model today because they were quite intolerant, quite inequitable, okay? Although I would say pluralistic, but certainly not the other two, democratic and tolerant. All right. Number 6, at the time of Spanish colonization of the Americas, Western Europe was arguably slowly transitioning toward a limitedly and brutally capitalistic economy. I did try to convey that. I tried to convey that on number 1 of the Southern colonies, and I mentioned it with the Spanish conquistadores, right? Because remember, they had a system of mercantilism, of only the well-connected to the king or queen would dictate who could engage in what type of economic opportunities, and it was very elitist. That began to fade away at the quote discovery and colonization of the Americas, where they began writing kind of blank checks, right, and saying whoever will go forward as an adelantado and claim pagan land, we will grant you minor hidalgo noble status. We'll grant you the right of an encomienda, which lasted for about a generation. And so you had opportunities that were there for the taking for virtually anyone. We talked about the indentured servant opportunity, the joint stock companies being granted colonies, and whoever was willing, without even a penny in his or her pocket, to come and work and try to colonize could be rewarded handsomely. Okay, and so absolutely that was meant to be conveyed. Number 7, which of the following was not arguably an historical contribution by the Spanish to the Americas? A monotheistic belief in the Christian God? Absolutely, they were not familiar with Christianity. Elements of law we have borrowed from Rome and Germanic sources? Yes. Modern notions of private property and of urban development, yes. To teach Native American tribes how to cultivate the land, no. They already knew how to do that. Many elements of Hispanic culture, yes. All right, so all of them but D are true, and you're looking for the one that's not true. Number 8, to give credit where credit is due, the Spanish were arguably more apt to allow African slaves to buy their freedom and integrate into Latin American societies. Yes, and I gave the name of an author who conveyed that in her book. Had a system of accountability? Yes. So both of those are true. All right. Las Casas and his brief relation of the destruction of the Indies openly sympathized with the Native Americans, whom he labeled as meek sheep? Yes. And he fought for protective rights for them. So that is all true. Castillo, his true history, right, in refutation of Las Casas's somewhat justified Spanish conquest, depicting the Native Americans as anything but meek sheep, that is true. And Sahagún was the gentleman that I mentioned in the video who was very empathetic toward the Aztec. He tried to write down and translate their codices of their history into Castilian Spanish, so future generations would be made, familiar with Mesoamerican history. He fought for their rights as a clergyman. Nevertheless, he is the one who has the quote saying that it wasn't the fault of the native Mexican people, the indigenous, giving their kids over for human sacrifice, that they were blinded by the devil. So hence, he thought paternalistic action was necessary. As much as he defended their rights, even he felt that it was imperative that they change their religion and stop human sacrifice and become good Spanish Catholics. So that is true as well. And Junipero Serra, number 12, was meant to convey the complexity. Look at letter C. The juxtaposition of praises for Spanish missionaries as benevolent, paternalistic defenders of Native Americans and their rights, but also criticism of them being ethnocentric tyrants. Remember, if you're ethnocentric, you believe that your worldview, your culture is the only viable one, and you see everything through your own cultural lens, and that they were tyrants enforcing the natives to kill their own culture and become Spaniards culturally. And that is true. All right. Don Juan de Oñate, did I show him as an example of multiculturalism and democracy? I did not. In Spanish New Mexico, remember I said the opposite in the lecture and in the video, contending that Oñate, if I subjectively, as a student, were told by an instructor to write a history of the Spanish conquest and to adhere to the Black legend, right? And kind of vilifying the Spanish as the anti-model of how we do not want to be today. And I had to do it within US territory. I arguably would choose New Mexico. A lot of conflict, a lot of power and domination, a lot of manipulation, a lot of war, rebellions, and brutality. And so I would have chosen Oñate and New Mexico. So certainly not as examples of multiculturalism and democracy. All right. Number 14, which of the following does not constitute a region of the modern United States that Spanish explorers and adelantados who came forward to claim land that was pagan, that was quote pagan, have been claimed in modern day United States? Everywhere except the Northeast. I mentioned nothing about Massachusetts and the New England states. I've yet to read of them up that far, up the East Coast. All right. Again, on number 15, you're looking for that which is false. Which of the following was not mentioned in characterizing Spanish colonization of the Americas? The Spanish colonizers were, by today's standards, religiously ethnocentric? Yes, right? They did see things through their own Spanish Catholic lens. Spanish authorities generally intended the Spanish Americas to be hierarchical. That's arguable, but yes, that was conveyed in the historiographical assignment on one of the numbers. C, the Spanish colony of New Mexico was depicted as anomalously out of the ordinary, tolerant, and democratic. No. And then D, in reality, in some places and regions, the average colonized man had limited economic opportunities and a slight voice in government. Yes, that was argued in defense of the Spanish in the argumentative assignment and in my lecture video. They had an accountability system. They had cabildos or city councils. Now on these, right, I'm going to give them to you especially because you may not have your textbook yet, and I didn't register with the school. And so all the more reason why I'm happy to just give them to you if you don't have your textbook yet. The textbook, number 16, illustrates how French colonization exercised an influence disproportionate to their numbers, largely because of their relationship with Native Americans. It cites as an example French intrusion into the Native American fur trade. That is true. The textbook does state that. Number 17, the textbook claims that rigid royal Spanish policies stifled economic development in the Americas. That is true as well. So notice, if you look at the textbook, if you have it, in chapters 1 and 2, especially 1, it kind of adheres to the Black legend. There's not a lot of good things that Alan Brinkley says about Spanish colonization. Number 18, a section from the Southern Colonies handout contends that colonial Virginia afforded an economically and politically equal playing field for all English colonists. No. It's more like the last number on the Spanish colonies assignment, where it says, were the English any better? And it depicts a very hierarchical, a very inequitable, a very kind of archaic, old school, backward colonial Virginia. So that the textbook does not do that. Number 19, Court American History portrayed John Smith as the embodiment of American leadership by merit or talent. Yes. Remember, that was David Price's In Love and Hate in Jamestown, that book. And that constitutes an entire section in the Southern Colonies handout. He does portray that as politically incorrect as that thesis is. Number 20, historian Helen Roundtree depicts the encounter between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in English court history fashion. No. She glosses over ethical components about right and wrong, winners and losers. No. C, from the perspective of Native American Powhatan Confederacy, absolutely. Depicting the latter as patient, long-suffering, and tactical, while portraying the English as greedy, dishonest, and ungrateful. And that's straight out of the argumentative assignment. So you notice, right, how many answers, how many questions are derived directly from your argumentative sections. That's why I cannot stress enough in the future, especially as I won't go through every question like this for tests 2 and 3, be sure that you read every section and study every section, despite the fact that I'm asking you to submit a written analysis and evaluation of only one section of your choosing. So instances of agency of non-WASP minorities mentioned in the Southern Colonies handout. You're looking for the one that was not there. The Powhatan Confederacy, its leadership arguably could have wiped out the English settlement at Jamestown. Yes. The Huron and Natchez making demands upon the French colonists. Yes, you find that in a number section. African-American slaves taking advantage of an acute need for their labor in South Carolina. Yes, that's a complete section. Remember, called Black Majority, the book that's cited. D, there was no section on women. Women acquiring their political and economic rights early in the Chesapeake, even if socially they were still stifled, and expectations for them to remain ladylike. That is actually true, but none of that was mentioned in your argumentative assignment. So that's the one that was not mentioned. All right. And by the way, oftentimes women were able to garner power that was not necessarily intended for them to grab because of demographics. There were so few in number, so there was a high demand for them. Oftentimes in many colonies, it was like as high as an 8-to-1 ratio of 8 men to every woman. And mortality rates were high, especially with malaria-like diseases in the swampy, humid areas of the Chesapeake. And a lot of men died and enhanced the high demand for women. Number 22, Alan Brinkley, who writes a textbook, contends in the textbook that the Spanish's command over Indian labor did not fully meet the demands for labor, so they opted for African slaves subsequently. Remember, that was put into a section. Remember that it contended very argumentatively, which you could argue against, that slavery was an economic rather than a racist decision, that they were running out of options to use Native Americans as their servants. That also is found in the textbook. That is true. Again, that's argumentative, all right? So I don't want you, if one thing you derive from my class, whatever you read, don't take as gospel truth. That the writer is oftentimes omitting or conveniently leaving out data that would go against his or her thesis. Number 23, which of the following was mentioned as factual support of the thesis that slavery was not a racist, but a practical and convenient institution? So you should find all of this in that section in the argumentative assignment. Diminishing or lowering numbers and reliability of white indentured servants, absolutely, that was stressed. The biological success of African Americans against New World pathogens, yes, and that helped develop their reputation for being hardy laborers, being strong and capable of doing the work that allegedly Native Americans could not do. They were dying. It was known as the demographic catastrophe. So many Native Americans died of European diseases that Africans did not die from. And remember, the white indentured servants often became very sickly when they came from England to do the work in the Chesapeake. And also they became known as rebellious and having high expectations on how well their treatment should be. C, diplomacy with Native American tribes, that is true. There were also treaties with tribes, agreements by Charles V of Spain and promises that they would no longer enslave the Native Americans. And war, even if the Europeans knew, the leaders knew they could win, war is costly. So if it could be avoided at times, Euro-American and European leaders made the decision to try to avoid it and to not antagonize the Native Americans any further. So all of those are true in defense of that thesis. Number 24, the instructor cited Howard Zinn's take on Bacon's Rebellion as a possible microcosm, mini example of all or except which. Capitalism created the incentive that prompted colonists to increase agricultural productivity, which enabled the Virginia joint stock companies to pay off investors and still afford to grant freedom dues to all indentured servants? No way. It was just the opposite of that, right? That arguably fed Bacon's Rebellion. A lot of them were ex-indentured servants who never received the land that was promised them. Even in Maryland, where they had a high reputation in the 1650s, they contend that only about a quarter of indentured servants lasted their indenture and received land. Only a quarter. And that's where it was supposedly better, in Maryland. B, an inequitable, unequal, or imbalanced right society, especially plagued by false promises. Yes, that is true. And demagogues taking over an unhappy population whose expectations had not been met. Absolutely, that fits the stereotypical image of Bacon's Rebellion. C, many Southern governments and planters may have opted for slave labor after the rebellion. Yes. 4 years later, Virginia legislator planned to import thousands of slaves, just 4 years after that rebellion. And to a lot of people, they don't believe that's a coincidence. So remember, you were looking for the one that's not true. Same thing for 25. Which of the following was not mentioned in class pertaining to the alleged conditions endured by African Americans? The slave codes provided the legal foundation for abuse, as they permitted harsh punishments for slaves' infractions and callously little accountability for the masters and overseers regarding their chastisement of slaves. That is true. The slave codes were draconian, as I put in there. B, Fogel and Ingerman's thesis that slave conditions weren't that bad because they wanted to look out for their expensive investments and hence felt compelled to treat their slaves well physically, has withstood scrutiny from other historians well? No. That's a very unpopular thesis. And you find that in the historiographical assignment, right? The argumentative assignment, saying Fogel and Ingerman's thesis does not hold water. There's plenty of evidence that they were not treated well. C, Madam's diaries, historical notices in newspapers and almanacs, evidence of like runaways, rebellions, violence, death, and excavated skeletal remains suggest that slaves and their masters lived in hostile relations. Yes, that is true. And that's also found in the argumentative assignment. So notice, on some of them, I'll say Alan Brinkley in his textbook, those are the exceptions. And as I put in your announcement, as you may notice, anywhere from like 3 to maybe 6 questions come from the textbook. Everything else is straight from the argumentative assignments. Number 26, French Louisiana's official and unofficial defiance of old world mercantilist restrictions upon opportunities for non-nobles was depicted in the Southern Colonies handout as having emanated or originated from the genuine egalitarian idealism of her leaders? No way. It was stated the opposite, right? That the leaders wanted to maintain an old school France-like Louisiana with a nobility, people knowing their place, restricting the opportunities and the latitude of day-to-day living for the average little people, as they were called, the petite gens. But it didn't happen that way, did it? But remember, it was emphasized in the handout that it happened almost by accident. It happened organically because of the circumstances in the New World. So 26 is false. 27, the French were depicted in the Southern Colonies handout as having greatly abused their strength in numbers and in resources in order to dictate terms with the Mississippi Valley tribes. No. Remember, the opposite was stressed, stressing the agency of the Mississippi tribes, that they dictated terms to the French because the French did not bring enough resources over. Okay? Number 28. Notice this one. This is another example, is a few, and I would venture to say a few, no more than about 3 or 4 questions on a given test. I may not have directly in an argumentative section, but I covered them. I filled that hole, if you will, in my lecture. So again, it is important, and I would highly recommend you listen to my lecture videos, however boring they are. All right? Because I know I mentioned this. The author of Albion C, David Hackett Fisher, he suggests all the following except, and notice I kind of gave you this one just in case you didn't see it in the video. So I'm really trying to help you on the first test. The demographic that was to establish first effective settlement of each region dictated the folkways and its own likeness. That is true. So in the South, right, it was largely founded and colonized by the gentry class. And they were agricultural, they were traditional, they were not democratic. They were into family loyalty and hospitality, a lot of things that the South will be later proud of. But a gentry type culture. The North will largely be bourgeois. Remember, bourgeoisie, that just means people from the city. They came from Bristol, Liverpool, London. They were accustomed to new trades. They were accustomed to commerce, lots of different artisans or skilled workers. So they're going to diversify their economy. And hence in the North, right, where the bourgeoisie takes over, it's going to embrace industrialization in the future. And it's part of the whole historiography of the Civil War, of the North and South being founded by two different demographics that encouraged their regions to develop in two divergent ways. Okay, B, that the South's seigneurial economy is where wealth and status are connected to who gets to own what land. A few people own most of the land. They command labor of other people on their land, and they engage in cash crop farming, usually one single crop that they sell for profit on the market. So we talked about tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, right? And then later, of course, in Mississippi, Alabama, cotton. All right. Are you guys still with me? Any thumbs up? You still alive? Have I bored you to death? Any questions on here on the chat?
Professor, there was a
Yeah.
big lag spike earlier, and we didn't hear the last bit of what you said earlier.
Oh no. Okay, which numbers?
We're on 28, right? I think we're like, you just finished B, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just like the last bit of what you were talking about it. We just couldn't, you froze and we couldn't hear you.
Okay. So note, right? Just the last part of it. Okay. Just note, right, that the answer is C. His thesis is kind of simple but intriguing. Is whatever the demographic was, right? The socioeconomic status, the category of the population, whatever the demographic was that first effectively settled any given region in the United States, they tried to make their society out in their own image. So the South, and it's kind of simplistic, but I think there's got to be some truth to it. The South was largely colonized by the gentry class. And what do you know? The gentry class were seigneurial. They were old school. They were accustomed to old traditions of like the nobility and the mercantilist system, and a few people owning most of the land and commanding others to do labor on the land for them. People being deferential and knowing their place. So they were not democratic or egalitarian at all. Agricultural, either pastoral, right, with cows or sheep, or farming, but not just farming their own food as wealthy people. They were cash crop farmers, having one crop sold, cultivated, and sold for profit. And what do you know? That seems to exactly have happened in places like Virginia and Maryland in the South and in the Carolinas, arguably. And in the North, right, it was largely founded by the bourgeoisie, the people of the city back in England, Bristol, Liverpool, London. They prided themselves, just like you see today, right, with San Francisco and other urban areas. They pride themselves on being more forward-looking, more progressive, more open to change, and which is considered, progressive or modern. They are more urban oriented, right, with developing more cities and more people living in bigger cities. And therefore, as far as novelty, therefore diversification in the economy, develop and get into new industries. So when new things happen, right, like the steam engine, the beginnings of mass production that will kind of help bring about the Industrial Revolution, it was the bourgeois North that are going to embrace this rather than the old school gentry South that colonized the South. And it's part of the whole historical narrative of the Civil War, right? And it's very simplistic, and it's been challenged for sure, but that the North was more progressive. It was more forward-looking and more modernized and embraced things as such. And the South was more backward and refused to change its ways, etc. And that the North and South went in two kind of incompatible directions. and that helped lead to the Civil War by the end of our class. Okay? But notice C, that most English immigrants to the South were liberty-loving, egalitarian Democrats? No way. The gentry class were anything but that. So C is the one that's wrong. Okay? This is another one that was put into the argumentative assignment, however briefly. Which of the following does not match? Now, please note, this is a subjective claim. This can be argued against. And remember, when I write these argumentative sections, they are not necessarily what I believe. I'm deliberately being one-sided, okay? So keep that in mind. Roger Williams was depicted as a well-meaning progressive advocate for religious freedom, which may have been encouraged by the intolerant mistreatment that he endured under Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. That is true. That was conveyed. And that's a very popular interpretation. B, William Penn was depicted as relatively sincere in his Quaker conversion and his desire to embody meekness and brotherly love in issuing his Charter of Liberties that granted representative government, freedom of conscience in the 1680s in colonial Pennsylvania. And that is true as well. Court history of William Penn. C, Dutch New Netherlands was depicted as having transferred tolerant policies back in the Netherlands to the New World without any hint of dampening those policies with ulterior motives about economic concerns. Some people believe that, but is that which was put forward on the argumentative assignment that I have for Northern colonies? I believe it's the very last number. If you've read it yet, no, right? The writer on number 4 in the Northern colonies does the opposite, kind of bashes the Dutch and says, basically, I don't give the Dutch credit for being tolerant. I think it was simply because of economics that they tolerated diversity. Only if and when and because certain demographics that they looked down upon and did not socially embrace or accept, that they were grudgingly allowed to stay because they were helping the Dutch economy. So that's the one that's false, according to the argumentative assignment. All right. Number 30, William Penn renounced his autocratic rule over Pennsylvania, willingly granting political rights and powers and economic resources and opportunities to commoners, including some marginalized and persecuted non-English folk from Europe. That is true. That's all part of court history of William Penn. Notice it's not the entire picture, but that is true. Number 31, William Penn showed courtesy and respect to Native Americans regarding diplomacy, or while he did, evidence suggests that he also enthusiastically pressed or pressured Native American tribes to sell him their territory without seeming concerned for their future. That was conveyed as well in the latest argumentative assignment. Okay. Number 32, coverage of the New England colonies entailed the concession that some of their institutions, churches and government, were relatively, compared to others, then democratic and progressive. Yes, that's number 1. That's section number 1. So coverage of them did entail that argument. So note, okay, I try to make everything argumentative because I want you to critically think for yourselves. So hence it's conveyed on my test as well. So you're not just looking for if something is true or not on a given question. You're looking if that argument was given in the argumentative assignments. Number 33, class coverage of the New England colonies conceded, right, that Puritans could be overbearing or tyrannical in demands for conformity amidst their rather angst-filled covenant notion. Remember, the covenant was if anybody in society, if especially high numbers of within society, begin sinning against God, that God is going to punish the whole society with war, with bad economy, with poor health, etc. That is true. That's found on number 2 of the Northern Colonies assignment. Number 34, an argumentative section contends with the court history notion that the Dutch colonizers of New York were progressive cosmopolitans, citizens of the world, being broad-minded, practicing tolerance on principle, implying that official Dutch tolerance in later New York may have been at least partially due to economic concerns. Yes. That was the more cynical revision of court history of the Dutch. And that was given in the assignment. Okay. Then the last 5, sometimes I'll do this. They seem a little random because they're kind of all over the place as far as the topics. To me, it's kind of like by the time I get to number 35 and writing my test, I think, okay, what obvious things that are oftentimes covered on tests in early US history classes have I not covered? Just some basic, almost universally considered significant events. And that's why I throw these in here, and the last 5 seem to be all over the place. Okay. Number 35, according to Alan Brinkley, our textbook, the British Navigation Acts were stifling to American colonists as they successfully upheld mercantilist policies here in America that limited colonists' economic opportunities. No, that is false. And you find that in chapter 4 of the textbook. Number 36, which of the following is false regarding the Sacred Expedition? Remember, that was in 1769 when Philip II had decided with his ordinance decree on exploration that there will be no more military conquests for Spain over any further Native American territories, but the territories that have already been conquered and already been claimed shall be assimilated, right? That they shall, I got the hiccups. They shall make the Native Americans drop their culture and become more Spanish and become good Christian Catholics. All right. So which of the following is false? It marked what the Spanish officially declared to be a more peaceful colonization of Upper or Alta California, as they called it, in contrast to Baja California. That is true. And you're looking for the false one. B, it initiated a Spanish colonization pattern of establishing missions, cities or towns, pueblos, presidios or military forts, and haciendas, which are ranches or farms. That is true. That was kind of their rubric of colonizing Upper California. C, Spanish missions have consistently and universally been praised as paternalistic purveyors of civilization. No way. Revisionist historians, right, contend that they were ethnocentrically guilty of cultural genocide, causing the natives of California to kill their own culture, that they were coercive institutions where they forced the natives on the missions. They had their daily lives very regimented. They engaged in bodily or corporal punishment when they were defiant. And when they ran away, they sent the armed forces under Vallejo to come look for them and forcefully bring them back to the missions. So C is certainly not true, that they have been consistently and universally praised. Revisionist history definitely has had its word against that. So that's the one that's false. Number 37, in the St. Lawrence River in the Ohio Valley. St. Lawrence River is in Canada, just above the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley right around and just beneath the Great Lakes. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. Okay. In the St. Lawrence River in Ohio Valley, tribes like the Iroquois took advantage of European demand for furs and militarily ensconced themselves into an economically vital partner position. That is true. They made war on the Huron took that land from them so that they could be the providers of the fur to the Europeans and dictate the price. So sometimes, right, European encroachments in the New World inadvertently or directly cause Native Americans not only to fight them, but to fight one another. And this is an example also of agency. The Iroquois made decisions that mattered. Whatever you think of those decisions, morally. 38, St. Augustine, Florida is the oldest surviving European American city. That is true. 1565. Still here. So I just thought that's just a basic that we ought to be familiar with. 39, the Puritan societal notion of the covenant arguably formed the foundation for their tolerance of individuals' lifestyles. No, just the opposite, right? Remember the covenant, the idea that God will break his covenant with Massachusetts Bay Colony if people start sinning. That caused them to become very paranoid. They even hired select men from the churches to come and spy on people in their homes to see if they were up to no good. So it arguably did the opposite. It arguably led to an intolerant, almost oppressive atmosphere. And number 40, Tories were the conservative party in England. We're going to get to that right after the test in the War for Independence. Okay, so being the conservatives, they thought that Americans were spoiled rotten, that we were not paying enough in taxes, that we were living the high life, and it was about time that we be put in our place. So Tories in the English Parliament during the 1770s allied themselves with the colonists in demanding colonial rights as English subjects. No way. The Liberal Party, some of them did, and they were known as the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. And the Whigs empathized with us, called us their American cousins. Because at that time, right, ethnographically, I mean, America was much more WASP, much more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Most of the immigrants were from the English Isles. And some of them did feel like we had justifiable grievances against British taxation here in the colonies, but certainly not the Tories. Okay. So that's it, everyone. Are there any last minute questions before we conclude the meeting?
For the textbooks, do you have like any recommendations of when we should start reading those?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt. It never hurts to become familiar and get good context, good surrounding situational information at any given time. So what we're covering on test 1 are chapters 1 through 3.
Okay.
So if you want to read 1 through 3, by all means, it can't hurt. Okay. Anybody else? All right, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go ahead and call this a meeting. Remember, you have until Saturday night to submit this. You have unlimited submissions. So by all means, take it until you're finished, or take it until you ace it. Okay. But I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. If you feel good, you don't have any further questions, go ahead and go ahead and take yourself out of the meeting and have a great day and have a great week. Okay. But remain on here, 1, 2, 3 of you, if you have a question that maybe you want to speak with just me about. Okay. So unless you have a question, you guys have a great day and a great week. Okay. I hope I helped you. All right. So those of you who are still on, I don't care who first. If you'd like to unmute and ask me a question, that'd be great.
Can you please go over 12 and 13 again? I
Sure.
did not get those.
Sure. So Junipero Serra, to me, so those, these are all symbolic to me. That's why I chose them. So Sahagún to me represents something. Oñate represents something. Las Casas does as well. And to me, Junipero Serra, he conveys to me the complexity of the historiography of Spanish conquest, the complexity of the writing of history books and historical accounts. Because on the one hand, right, like you see on C, the juxtaposition, on the one hand, you have court hagiographies. Hagiography is when you try to make a saint of someone and writing a biography of them. And so you still can find old school court history of the Spanish friars of being very Christ like, making great sacrifices on behalf of the Native Americans, just doing much for them to try to teach them to become economically self sufficient, good Christian Catholics, etc. Right? And then you have the 180-degree turn of revisionist historians who say, no, the Spanish were awful. They caused the Native Americans to kill their own culture, etc. So what you're looking at is C for number 12.
Okay.
Okay. And then 13, Don Juan de Oñate, he did not represent multiculturalism and democracy to me, nor Spanish New Mexico. As I stated earlier, if I had to adhere to the Black legend as a student and make villains of the Spanish, I would arguably choose New Mexico to do my research in because there's so much conflict, domination, rebellion, manipulation, power plays, etc. It was anything but multicultural and democratic.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're very
And
welcome.
this is recorded though, right? We can just look at it again.
You can. You
Okay.
can. Yeah, I'll have this posted as soon as I can.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a
Bye.
good day.
Have a good
everyone.
weekend.
You as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.